The gentlemen in the corner are still doing this, which I think means we must wait. Okay, now they're doing this, which means we can start. Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to this event here, sponsored by UNAIDS and the Global Council on AIDS, Inequality, and Pandemics. We are here to kind of just a day after the historic pandemic agreement was gavelled in at the World Health Assembly down the road from here. And we're thrilled to be joined by luminaries in the world of thinking about pandemics and inequality. And we particularly wanted to do this event today, both to gather people, a small group here in Geneva, but also to broadcast around the world to think about the ways in which the world has and has not shifted when it comes to the inequalities that are driving pandemics today. We know that from the HIV experience, from the Ebola experience, from the COVID-19 experience, from the Mpox experience, and we will certainly know from whatever the next pandemic is that hits us, that inequality is not just a bad thing in general, but that inequality creates the conditions through which outbreaks turn into pandemics, and pandemics last for years. We know that it's where those inequalities hit that we end up with viruses that don't necessarily have the power to do anything per se on their own when it comes to achieving a global scale, are able to transform into things that halt economies, that disrupt life, and that take millions and millions of lives. That happens because of the inequality conditions that have been built in our societies and between our countries and in the world. And so this event is aiming at that core question. UNAIDS started the Global Council on Inequality, AIDS, and Pandemics, which I think I say in a different order every time I say it, so apologies. We started the council because we wanted to try to get at this issue. And over the last, especially 18 months, council members have dug into what are some of the kind of evidence points and what are some of the policies that might address these core inequalities. The council is chaired by former First Lady Monica Gingos, Professor Joe Stiglitz, and Professor Michael Marmot, but include fantastic people, including Nisia Tundaje, who is with us today, who joined when she was the Minister of Health of Brazil. And we were so thrilled to get to work with you, Minister Tundaje, when we were when you were the G20 chair, and to really drive forward some of the things that the G20 could do to address inequalities. And we'll turn to that in just a moment. And then we've been thrilled to get to work with Precious in various spaces to think about this kind of pandemic treaty today, the WHO pandemic agreement, and what it can do when it comes to tackling the pandemics to come. And I hope the pandemics that we have today, and we'll talk about that some as well. Just a few words of just thanks to everybody that put this together, and a particular thanks to Chris Fontaine, who did a ton of work to make this happen. And thanks to all of you who are joining us all around the world to think about this together. You can kind of view the pieces, and please feel free to ask questions and questions in the room as well. We'll go through, and I have the distinct privilege to get to ask the first set of questions to these nice people who have assembled, and then we'll open it up to the room. So here we have with us, gathered fantastic leaders, starting to my right with Dr. Precious Matsotso, who is known to anybody who works in global health, and certainly anybody that works in global HIV, as the longtime Director General of the Department of Health in South Africa, where she led any number of incredibly important pushes in highly complex political environments to try to tackle the HIV pandemic, to tackle other pandemics as they came. And I think there are very few people in the world who are better positioned to then try to lead 194 member states to try to create an agreement about what to do in pandemics. We could have chosen, I think the world could have chosen, Dr. Tedros could have chosen any number of people to help lead that. But the fact that, Precious, you were there doing that meant that it started from the get-go trying to address inequalities. And I think your stamp is on it. And so let us first just start with a round of congratulations for having passed a pandemic agreement. So thank you for being here. Former Minister of Health of Brazil, Minister Nícia Trindade, is also with us, who is also kind of world-renowned in many ways. She had a small thing on her CV, which is she was Minister of Health. She changed the world on health well before she was minister. And in leading Fiocruz and in all of the work that you did, one of my favorite things about Minister Trindade is that she is a social scientist. As a social scientist, it makes me happy, and actually comes to the job having studied the movements that change health and the ways in which mobilizing people and communities has transformed the health system of Brazil and has transformed health systems around the world, and brought that to her time as Minister of Health. And so thank you for being here. Executive Director of UNAIDS, Winnie Byanyima, who in this building doesn't need a big introduction, but I will say is Undersecretary General of the United Nations, is my former, current, and sometimes boss, and leads the United Nations Joint AIDS program from a position of tackling inequalities first. And so one of the first things that she did, having led Oxfam, having led things in UNDP, having been a minister, having done a number of things on that front, came and brought to UNAIDS an inequality framework that has guided the work over the last few years. And so Winnie, thank you for being here. And then finally, Javier Padilla Bernaldez is the Secretary of State for Health of Spain, and comes to us having worked, again, on the front lines of addressing inequality in health systems in Madrid. And so thank you very much for being here. And also thank you for joining our Global Council. And so I wanted to welcome you as the newest member of the council. So with that, let's get into it. So we're gonna start with talking about the pandemic agreement. And so 3 years ago, this negotiation started. And we were on the phone yesterday with Professor Marmot, who talked about kind of launching the most recent WHO report on the social determinants of health that just came out. And one of my favorite lines that he had yesterday was that he said, it took us 7 years to get that report out. It only took Precious 3 years to negotiate a pandemic accord. And so all in all, it seems like a pretty breakneck pace. It is remarkable that in this time of global crisis, of deep inequality, of acrimony and discord, that we have in front of us a pandemic agreement that does more than just say pandemics are bad. Instead, it really does have dozens of different international legal shifts that come underneath this accord, and we hope will be quickly ratified. We hope that it will be quickly taken up, and we hope that it will be implemented in the spirit that the opening paragraphs give us. And so I'm going to turn first to Precious to have you open us. Tell us a little bit, if you would, about what do you think, as we sit here thinking about inequality and pandemics, what do you think the elements are that in this pandemic agreement might actually shift those inequalities, make us more safe by making us more equitable? I think you have to push there and bring the microphone your way.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. It's a real honor actually to join you just after the pandemic agreement was adopted by members of the World Health Assembly. Coming from a background where we have lived through stark inequalities and having seen how structural drivers undermine our ability to respond, particularly to fight HIV/AIDS, it was quite important for me personally to reflect a bit on the experiences and the journey we traveled through when HIV/AIDS was ravaging our villages, our communities, and we saw similarities with COVID-19. But what was most disturbing is that it was almost like deja vu, you know? Problems with access to pandemic health-related products was a repeat of what we saw with ARVs, what we saw with diagnostics. And the question we had was, how do we prevent this from happening ever again? And what is important, particularly with this pandemic agreement, is that there are equity provisions, but there are also provisions that deal with inequalities, because both need to be dealt with and both need to be addressed. With regard to inequalities, we have preambular paragraphs that recognize that discriminatory practices in whatever form are not acceptable, but there are already conventions that exist, whether discriminatory practices against women or discriminatory practices based on gender. Mm-hmm. And I must say it was difficult because just having the word gender in the pandemic agreement was a big, big battle. And I must say I was kind of disappointed because initially, a number of paragraphs made provisions for gender equality. And it was systematically and consistently removed until we were left with what, one word, two words. But, you know, just having one in itself is important because it can serve as a hook. And it gives us hope because we can do something about it. So it is not just those kind of practices, but I must say discriminatory practices in any form, because during COVID, we saw in some countries that those who present with comorbidities were people of certain racial groupings. And it must never, ever happen again that when we need access to vaccines or access to diagnostics, that certain groups do not have access. And this is not just a inter-country, it's intra-country, inter-country issue. Because I know that when we talk about inequities and inequalities, we always talk about North-South, but we also need to talk about those that happen within countries. And we have to deal with them decisively. So I'm quite hopeful that with the provisions that we have, there are equity-related provisions. And for those countries that were subjected to inequities, where they did not have access to vaccines on time so that they could respond decisively, these provisions are a great promise, actually. I think what is different with the AIDS process, HIV journey, is that we did not have a legally binding instrument that could hold the whole world accountable and that could commit the whole world. And I'm quite pleased that at least we have this instrument. So it's the beginning, it's not the end in itself, it's the beginning of a process. But remember, it's not just about COVID or other infectious diseases, it's also about HIV/AIDS. And we should read into this pandemic agreement, all pandemic. Thank you.
So let me ask you one more question, and then I'm going to come to the other panelists to just answer just briefly, kind of as you think about the pandemic agreement. As you think about the pandemic agreement, what areas do you think are particularly important when it comes to inequality? But Precious, as you think about kind of the next steps then for countries, you named a few of those provisions, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. Do you have particular areas where, as you think about what member states need to do now to actually make it have the kind of impact on inequalities that are driving pandemics that we want? What do you see as the key kind of next steps? I mean, I assume the first one is you must ratify it. So attention countries, please ratify it so it comes into being. But are there other pieces that after all these negotiations, you think are the top priorities now that the pandemic agreement has actually been adopted?
Well, I guess the manner in which we drafted the resolution, we took into account the fact that, treaties by themselves take time to ratify. Firstly, to come into force and ratify, and, they entail a lot of processes, particularly at national level. You need parliaments to ratify, you need, countries to put measures in place to be able to implement. But in this particular case, there are two steps that are essential that we considered, that we provided for in the resolution. The first is that of setting up a IGWIC, Intergovernmental Working Group. So I know that when we speak about the Intergovernmental Working Group, people are saying, oh, another 3 years, it's going to take long negotiations. But I think what's different here is that the Intergovernmental Working Group is going to focus specifically on the pathogen access and benefit sharing. And this process is kind of given a timeline. The negotiations to have an instrument and an annex in terms of Article 12 should happen within a year. And we're hoping that the Intergovernmental Working Group will do that with the support and help of experts and involvement of relevant stakeholders. However, the most important is that there are two other streams of work. The first is preparatory work that must happen before COP is established. And that preparatory work, I think we took a leaf from the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. You'll recall that when the FTCT was adopted, there was also a similar process that was established. There was IGWIC that had to do preparatory work to look at all the procedural aspects and ensure that when COP was established, it could hit the ground running. But the third, which is directly related to your question, is about the intermediate and interim arrangements that countries could consider. Meaning, without prejudice, countries can start looking at the pandemic agreement and consider those things that can be implemented. Let me use one. I mean, you cannot wait for COP to ensure that your health workforce and your health workers are protected. You don't have to wait to ensure that there are personal protective equipment. You don't have to wait to start strengthening your health system. Of course, we've been preaching over years that the health system needs to be strengthened. Even during the HIV/AIDS era, we've been saying the same thing. So that work has to start. It doesn't have to wait. Preparatory can begin, but those are just some of the examples. The regulatory one, if you want products to be approved, if you want research and development to happen, if you want diversified local production, you need a regulatory system that works. You need a regulatory system that is effective. So for that reason, you don't have to wait. You can start having those measures put in place in different countries well in advance. However, whatever you consider now, and this we carefully thought about, is that you should not put measures in place that are going to undermine the whole pandemic agreement. So this can be carefully chosen. Thank you very much.
I'm really glad that you mentioned health workers, and that is, I'll do a small plug, which is at Georgetown we have something that we created with the World Health Organization called the Health and Care Workers Policy Lab, looking at the ways in which laws protect health workers. And from that data, what we find is that more than half of countries don't have laws that make PPE required for all health workers, including community health workers. And that's where you see these kind of massive inequalities come, where you see, in tertiary hospitals, physicians having access to great PPE, but those people who are on the front lines, who actually in COVID died in large numbers because they were the community health workers, they're not legally protected. They're not entitled as a right to help to protection. And so those kinds of provisions, if they come out of the pandemic accord, it would be really, really brilliant. Let me turn now, and I'm going to start, I might start in the middle. Maybe I'll start with Winnie, if that's okay, and then come to you, Nisi, and to you too, Javier. But Winnie, do you have pieces from the accord as you think about this agreement? What do you see as the pieces that will have the biggest impact when it comes to inequality? And do you see areas that still need a bit more work?
Thank you, Matt. I have to start by congratulating Precious for co-chairing together with France and doing taking on such a difficult task and seeing it through. And Eunicia for vice chairing. And of course, Dr. Tedros, I think you have proved that multilateralism is alive and well, that through global cooperation, we can save humanity. These things are important today, so thank you. Yes, for us at UNAIDS, we were supporting this process and we were fighting to get our lessons, what we've learned from fighting a pandemic, what works into that treaty. And I'm happy that those principles, such as the centrality of human rights in fighting a pandemic, the leadership of communities in fighting a pandemic, and the equitable access to technologies, to whatever is available for everybody. These are key, and they are now quite explicitly reflected in the treaty. That's important for us. I may also add that we were also pushing that it's important to indicate clearly that you need a multi-sectoral, whole of society, whole of government approach to win against a pandemic. Because a pandemic isn't just about health, it's about so many other things. So these are well reflected. But of course, Matt, an agreement of this kind is a compromise, and a compromise doesn't give you everything you want. We do not feel that it's as ambitious as we had wanted, particularly in some areas. But like I say, it is a compromise, and we are an advocacy program. We will be pushing governments to implement ambitiously, even if in some areas we don't see the ambition we want. I did notice that in the late stages, some rich countries were pushed and softened, let me say, the language on technology transfer. But still, there is a footnote that, and they wanted to say technology transfer must never be mandatory. But there is a footnote saying that still, this should not prevent countries from doing whatever it takes to access the technology they need. So there is a way it is balanced out. Oh, something has gone wrong. But for us, that aspect of pathogen access and benefit sharing was such a crucial area for reaching agreement. And we think there is what is there is good enough for us to continue pushing and ensuring that there is equity of access during a pandemic, before and during a pandemic. Thank you.
Precious, we'll ask you to tell us all the secrets of what was negotiated and who. No, we won't go there. But the point that this was a really complex negotiation I know probably 3% of the drama that probably happened in various ways, but it was a deeply, deeply political agreement where many things were put on the table, they were taken off the table, they were put back on the table at various moments. And so I wonder if I can turn to you, Nicia, to ask, as you think about this pandemic agreement, thank you for all of the work that Brazil did in that process. That was, Brazil played a really unique and important role, both when you were minister and in these last days, at kind of finding places where the pandemic agreement could be bold, but also pass. And I think that was really complicated. So as you think about this question of what's in the agreement now that you think might make a difference for the future, what do you think about most?
Thank you very much, Matt, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to sharing ideas with you, Precious, Winnie, and Javier Padilla. I think, first of all, I think that after COVID-19 pandemic, it's no longer possible to separate the economy, innovation, and social policies. I think that's in my vision, the most important point in this agreement. The second point is the possibility of approval the agreement, pandemic agreement yesterday. I think that it was the most long applause that I saw of my life. And why? Of course, because of the importance of the agreement, but we have to see the context. A lot of attacks against this environment, against our union, with contradictions. Of course, it's a political process. There are many interests. There are the global South, the global North, and everything that you talk a lot in our meetings. But I think that it's time to have conscience about the need of right direction against the effects of inequalities and the interdependence of the societies of the national states to have to reduce at least to prevent and to reduce the impacts, the social, economical, and so on impacts of this process of pandemics. And I think that there are at least 6 important points related to the agreement. Many of them mentioned by Precious and by Winnie. One, I think that is the idea of not think about pandemic as a specific matter of health or surveillance. And think that is fundamental is strengthening health system and taking care of workforce. I think that's very, very important. The second point is to think about how to combine equitable access to decentralized production, innovation at the local and regional level. Because we think about equitable access for a long time, but now I think that we could highlight that it's not possible only the technological transference process. It's important just to have, besides this, innovation and the strengthen local policy in the countries for this. I think that the third point is the creation of a financial coordination mechanism. I don't know how this pillar could be in practice, but I think that's very important to be established in the agreement. Another point already mentioned was the establishment of the pathogen access or benefit sharing mechanism. I know that that was one of the most controversial things during the discussions, the debates. And now we have 1 year to advance in this topic. But I think that many points are important to think about sharing benefits. I think that it's a good beginning, as Precious had mentioned. The last point that I'd like to highlight is the commitment that products developed with public funding have to be distributed equitably. I don't know, but I have never seen this topic showing this way. So I think that these concrete points show, I think, that you can hope a good process, not seen, as Precious had mentioned, the agreement as the end of a process. It was a very important point. It is a very, very important agreement. I'd like to thank all people in INB. Brazil, as you had mentioned, Matt, had a very are very committed with these principles. Ambassador Tovar Nunes had a good work for this proposal with the co-chairs, Precious, Anne Claire, many other people. But I would like to reinforce that this commitment is also of the President Lula, who shared these visions and discussed this topic with when I was as Minister of Health. So just to finish a short idea, I think that, and I follow as sociologists, as you had mentioned, German sociologist Klaus Eder, and he says that societies can learn, but the world is very difficult to change. So I think that you have to think about this. It's not easy to change things. It's not easy to transform so unequal world, but you have to put things on the table. We have to agree for topics that are crucial for our life in this earth. So I think that is a process, and I'd like to take part in this process in my position as researcher, as a person on global health, just to help this agreement to go advance as we need. And you know, it's very, very hard times, difficult political times. So the agreement in itself is something to be celebrated. Thank you.
Let me turn to Javier, and then I'm going to also come back just as using my moderator privilege here for a minute to Winnie and Precious in a moment to talk a little bit more about. Nicia kind of raised this question of the R&D provisions, and I do think those might be some of the more interesting pieces. So I want to dig into those in just a moment. But Javier, your same question over to you. You know, especially having you know, you come to this from a high income country, a member of the EU. You know, I won't put you too much on the spot, but I'll say that there were many moments in negotiations where we could see Spain taking a position that was a bit more progressive than much of Europe, and actually pushing opening some space in doing so. So I wonder, as you reflect on where we've landed, if you have thoughts both on the kind of content, but I'd also be interested if you have thoughts on kind of where does this leave Spain as its kind of positioning within the world?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I think that one of the things that the agreement has brought to us is that it has broken the fixed blocks that were, because we are talking about global north and global south, but in global north, there are some countries which have tried to internally to move the position, and especially at the level of the European Union, many times, in many occasions, we as Spain, we felt closer to the positions that some countries, for instance, like Brazil, were defending, but we had to try to perform our responsibility that was not only to go on public to defend our position, but trying to move the European Union position in order not only to be coherent with in public with our position, but also to be useful in order to move the European Union position to make the agreement possible. I think that the first effect of the pandemic agreement is the agreement itself, in a context where everybody is giving steps back. We are giving together a step forward, and I think that it's the first effect. Also, I would like to say that some of the parts of the pandemic agreement are already having effect on inequalities before being approved. I want to outline an example when the public health emergency of international concern for Mpox, when it was signed last summer in Spain, we agreed to make a donation of the 20% of our vaccine, Mpox vaccine stock, and to invite to the other member states of the European Union to do the same. And it was based on the discussions on the pandemic agreement. So the pandemic agreement is the result, but it's also the way to get to this agreement that is already having some effects. I think that there is also something very interesting that was said by Winnie, and it's like it's going to amplify state-level actions. And I think it's also very important. In some countries, we are talking at the political level about pandemic preparedness, prevention, preparedness, and response. And it's also because of the debates and the discussions that have been held under all the pandemic agreement procedure. And I think that it's also going to be very, very valuable. But if I had to outline only one thing, that would be one thing that maybe many people is saying that it's not as satisfying as we would have liked, and it's everything related to tech transfer. Having an agreement where tech transfer is even mentioned, I think it's also the possibility condition to be given many steps in other situations. And Precious was talking about that it's not only an agreement for COVID or some situation like that, but also for HIV, for instance. And I think that the pandemic agreement is going to be like the framework we are going to use when talking about lenacapavir or talking about some other instruments that we are going to say now, okay, we have agreed on that. So how are we going to use on these innovations that are really going to change the landscape? And I think that these words on technology transfer that maybe are not like the ideal that we would have chosen, but for sure are the ones that are going to make us able to go further.
Please. And as you come in, Winnie, let me just, what I would love to do is spend a few minutes on this question, because one of the things that all of you highlighted was this kind of interesting new ecosystem that is potentially being built when it comes to innovation and access by this pandemic agreement. The fact that you've got not only tech transfer provisions, but you've also got conditionalities on R&D in here, and you've got PABs out there. It actually does take several bites at the apple. So I think it's a really interesting thing to dive into. So Winnie, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. I wanted to speak to that last point you made, because we were here. I actually just arrived here at UNAIDS when COVID hit us. And we saw, and it was really shocking for the people I work with here, the allies, the communities that we work with, to see the same mistakes that were made in the early years of HIV being repeated. We created a coalition, we called it People's Vaccine Alliance. We spoke very forcefully, but it was interesting to see how research that was publicly funded, that had been done over so many years, being appropriated by a company, and then a company running away with it and hoarding the technology and maximizing profits. Our allies in the United States of America worked very hard to speak with the White House, because there was an administration there that was listening to us in civil society and in the UN to say, look, you have put in $32 billion in this mRNA vaccine. How can two companies monopolize your public funding and hoard the vaccine? And their hands were tied. The White House was clear. Our hands are tied. We do not have a way. I remember talking to Professor Fauci. It is our science. It is our work here at NIH that Moderna has used to make the vaccine. But we do not have any way to compel them to put the vaccine to public use, to reap back what taxpayers have put in. This agreement makes it clear that a principle of pandemic response will be that of sharing what has been paid for publicly. There will be conditions to public funding of any health technology that comes out. This is so important for us. It's a major, major breakthrough, and Nisia, you have referred to it, because 12 million people in Africa died waiting for HIV antiretrovirals. This time they say 1.3 million people lives could have been saved and not been lost during COVID had the vaccine been shared more equitably. So really, to me, this agreement has laid the foundation for us to take this work further. We haven't got everything we wanted on that front, but has laid the foundation for building on it to ensure that never again do we have millions around the world dying when a life-saving technology is there. Thank you.
Precious, is the best way to understand that, following on Winnie's point, how should we understand the kind of ecosystem that the pieces of the pandemic treaty or agreement now put together? Because I'm interested that when I remember the very first draft, I remember the zero draft, and it doesn't look that radically different, interestingly enough, but much has changed, right, since the earliest draft. But one of the most interesting things that comes out of the pandemic treaty accord agreement, I keep calling it all of the different names. Is it a treaty? Is it an accord? Now it's an agreement. We're done debating the name, but surely not the interpretation of it. Is the way to think about what this agreement does, that it tries to create a different kind of ecosystem. I think about the provision on conditions in R&D. I think about the provisions on investment in R&D. I think about then the tech transfer provisions, and then I think about the PABs. So how do you put those things together, and how would you describe what this is trying to achieve?
Well, I think in a way you are right. It kind of reconfiguring the ecosystem. It's not building a new one. It's just reconfiguring it in such a way that it's responsive. I mean, some of you may be aware that there's been this debate over a number of years about having an R&D treaty. And if you go back to look at the debates and discussions about an R&D treaty, you'll realize that one of the components was about publicly financed R&D treaty, research and development. And what this does, it kind of, in a very nuanced way, captures some of those elements of having an R&D treaty. What I think is important about this, and I think it's helpful because it's
Precious,
it's pulled all the provisions and elements together in a much more comprehensive and integrated way. Because as I was using the R&D treaty example, because it was just looking at R&D in isolation, not taking into account that you need technology transfer. In some instances, you'd need diversify a local production. It might as well be that some of the products exist and they just need to be repurposed. So this allows for that. But it's not only about when products are developed, it's about how they are distributed, because it's across the whole value chain that you want to understand how the products are going to reach the mouths, the bedside, but also how vaccines are going to reach arms. So from that perspective, you need to understand this in a much more comprehensive way. Let me use an example, and just to paint a picture. You know, say you have an outbreak in a particular country, but it's a pathogen of unknown origin. The very first thing you want to do is to characterize it so that you know how it spreads, you know how quick it spreads, and so on. But you also need to know how to tackle it. You need a diagnostic, you need a vaccine. You might as well not need a vaccine, but a therapeutic. So you need that kind of approach where you bring in a collaborative effort. That's why we have some collaboration and some provisions that deal with global collaboration, but also elements that will allow for that work to happen. And this is where your PABS component come in. As to what you do with the biological material, pathogen, sequence information, I think will determine how the whole ecosystem works. It can lead to the production of a vaccine, a production of a diagnostic, but to also determine in the event that happens, how then can people access those products, the pandemic-related health products. And this is what is outlined. And of course, we agree that not every country can produce. Then you have to then look at regional capacities, but also the system of production. So it's not enough to just produce. How are the logistics organized so that the products can reach the facilities? And once they're used, the health workforce, how will they benefit from there, but not only them and the rest of the population? So there's some logic in the manner in which this has been put together. Thank you.
Well, and I one of the things that that I think is very interesting, and this is my political science hat on for a moment, just to say that, during COVID, one of the strategies that we deployed was to say the way that we will share is we will focus on doses, and we will say let's have a few producers make vaccines, and those few producers we will buy centrally some of those doses and distribute them. And it didn't work, right? It really didn't achieve equity. And it didn't achieve equity, not because that was I think a terrible idea, but because it missed the politics that was going to happen, which was no head of state stood up and said, we're going to wait. This population is not all going to get vaccinated because we need to ensure equity. That was not a politically possible thing. And in fact, every study of international relations would tell us that in the middle of a crisis, every country acts when they see existential threat to address it. And so we shouldn't assume that actually we will see the kind of cooperation. What I think is interesting about this new treaty is that it maybe makes some steps to recognize that, to say that in fact, we don't inherently expect global cooperation that looks like what peacetime looks like, some sharing that might happen and some functioning that might happen in global health, but instead expects nationalism, right? And so I want to turn to you, Nisia, to talk about.
Maybe let me tell you that I think we need to recognize that global cooperation doesn't necessarily have to be linked to the production elements. I think global cooperation, I think we've witnessed that, particularly with regard to how scientists work together and the network of studies that were conducted. And that in itself shows that there is kind of a platform that has been created to allow, and I think the blueprint, the WHO R&D blueprint actually creates that platform. So the cooperation is possible. We've seen it happen, but of course, at different levels. The one about manufacturing and production, of course, you're right. I mean, the heads of states will want to protect their citizens. But what we see with this agreement is that you can do that. However, allow for tech transfer so that others can produce for their own. And I think this is the difference.
I agree, and that is where I was going, because I think that's exactly what's interesting. Okay, Javier, and then I'm going to come to Nicia. This is what I think is interesting, right? And so I want to push us there. This agreement does not necessarily assume that there will be cooperation in doses, but that there can be cooperation by saying, if everybody is going to look out for the interests of their citizens, then we need to decentralize science and we need to decentralize ownership. And if we do, then you create opportunities for collaboration that weren't otherwise there. And so let me go to Javier, and then I'm going to come over to Nicia, because I really want to hear about the global coalition, because I think that's an interesting thing. But Javier, please come in.
Yeah, I would like to say that I don't really agree that there was not that cooperation. The thing is that that cooperation was given under the recognition of common interest between certain groups. For instance, at the European level, we really cooperated, and doses were not arriving before to Germany than to Lithuania, for instance, and doses were being equally distributed inside the European Union. So I think that this agreement recognizes a broader coalition of commons between the different countries, and not only regionalizing that. And I think that this is one of the steps forward between the previous pandemics and the next one.
No, thank you for that. It's a really important point. So then, Nicia, over to you. And I think, one of the really interesting things is, I think if that you all, through Brazil, through your leadership in the G20, have started this global coalition that was signed yesterday. So congratulations.
Thank
Right?
you.
I would like actually a round of applause for the new coalition that's been created yesterday. And I think it starts to do this, right? It starts to say, well, what if there's a coalition that really thinks about disrupting the idea that there are only going to be a few producers, and that creates this political problem of having not enough doses of anything? That means that you're only having Lithuania and Berlin sharing, right? And so how do you do that at a global level? So can you tell us a little bit about the coalition, and how does that fit with the treaty?
Yes, I think that there are very points of connection between the proposal of Global Alliance for Innovation Production for Health, approved during G20 with the leadership of Brazil, but many contributions, of course, and the agreement. But before, I just would like to mention an article that I published with many other authors in Nature in 2021 in the Nature journal about the need of reboot the R&D for health. And many data we organized there, especially the situation of clinical trial in many countries, for instance, South Africa, and the effect of not sharing benefits. Many other points in this article, and of course, the point of the need of technological transfers and the local, regional innovation, sharing knowledge, and so on. I think, important data. In September 2021, only 10% of countries applied 76% of those of available vaccines at that time. So we have to change this next time. This is a very concrete point. It's not ideology, as the criticism says, it is very concrete. So we have to change this. But in terms of the global coalition, I think that there are important points here. The idea of organize the sharing knowledge, organize the basis for production, education related, training related to this process. These are the pillars. But I think that there are a very important point, especially discussing within UNAIDS. The idea of not list traditional neglected diseases as the focus of the coalition. It was approved not for pandemic, but for neglected diseases. But we put on table, and Brazil was very, how to say that, in this idea that we have to think about neglected people, the first thought. So with this, it was possible to include, for instance, HIV/AIDS in the scope of the coalition. And it was not easy. It wasn't. It was a very, very hard discussion about this because it's obvious, but you need to say as the technological basis and the technology and the scientific basis advanced, at the same time, the inequalities enlarged. Yeah. And so that disease that were not seen as neglect became neglected because it's not a problem of the disease, it's a problem of power, economic interest, and so on. And so I think that is an important point for mention. The alliance address structural factors that separate innovation from access. Some of these points I had mentioned to have a very good diagnostic about the capacities. So I think that is an important point mentioned in the agreement, WHO monitoring this process and these capacities. So have to link these two processes, I think. Besides this, I think that we have to recognize in the global production and innovation capacity, strengthen opportunities more inclusive for the global health system. I think that it's possible, as Precious had mentioned, is not to think that each local could produce in the same level vaccines, diagnostic, but with a global arrangement, and the coalition is a tool for this, we can advance in this proposal. So I think I just have a last point that I think is very important, connect to agreement. Yesterday, the coalition was signed, as Matt had mentioned. So I hope that work goes very well. The Brazilian new Minister of Health, Minister Alexandre Padilha, was committed, of course, with this goal. But I think that it's very important to mobilize civil society. And the civil society had a very good role during the approval in during G20 and the discussions after for the approval of the coalition with this integrated perspective, health system vision, multi-sectoral approach, as Javier had mentioned, And again, it's not the end, it's a process, very connected process. And I think as well that for coalition and for the pandemic agreement, in other words, for equitable access to help to protect health in a broader perspective, we need a strong role of agencies like UNAIDS, UNITAID, because they are tradition on put on table and organize the agenda for improve access, equitable access. And now I think that in the UNITAID event, this point was very stressed, the idea of the today equitable access is not to be assistencialist, or nothing against assistencialism. We need humanitarian help, but we need to have sustainable basis for this. So when you think about sustainability, I think that the scope of our coalition in G20 and the proposals of the pandemic agreement have to work together with this philosophy and with this organized basis for work in this direction. I think that the coalition is a contribution for the same objective, not to deal with the pandemic theme specifically, but the basis for organized society is the same. I think that is to put this in movement. And so there are a synergy between these two processes.
Thanks for that. And so I'm gonna, in just a moment, I'm gonna open us up to a few questions before we close. But I think this is a really interesting point about, and I think it speaks to what you were saying, Javier, about, if we watch it during pandemics, we see how states act, and we know that there's a range of what states might do, right? And we can either hope that somehow states will act radically different during the pandemic than they have in any other pandemic, or we can try to design systems that might account for how states actually act during pandemics. And I think that's where the agreement and some of the work that's being done right now gives us an opening and an opportunity, right? Is to say, if you can produce locally and regionally, we know that in Europe there was sharing, we know that in Africa there was sharing, we know that in Latin America there was sharing, and yet we were trying to act as a globe and have one system. And so does the agreement give us some opportunities to actually interrupt that and create equity even amidst the actual world that we have? I think that's really interesting. And this coalition might well go a long way toward advancing that. Let me give just one minute each to Winnie and Javier, if you've got further thoughts on this. And especially, we're sitting in the UNAIDS building. I would be remiss if I didn't say, what's this going to do for HIV? And then I'll open it up.
But just to agree very much with Nisia, and to congratulate Brazil for your leadership in G20. It's true, there were some G20 countries who wanted to narrow the scope of what the global coalition could do. And you insisted, and the Global Council supported, lobbied for it to be wider. Look, today, we know from UNAIDS that last year, 2023, there were only 3.5 million people using PrEP for prevention. And we have a target of 10 million. We are not going to reach it. There are many reasons why people don't take PrEP. It's available, but they don't access it. But there is this amazing technology, lenacapavir, that Gilead has invented that could be a solution for millions of other people. However, it's not yet available, and it could take years and years to become available. This is not a way to fight and win against a pandemic. We would want that lenacapavir is licensed to many companies, or in every region, production would increase, prices would come down. Today, it's about $40,000 on the market in the US for treating highly resistant HIV positive people used as treatment, 40,000. We are told that it could go down to $40 per person per year if it was licensed for generic production in all regions. Why isn't it happening? Because the world has put itself in a situation where a producer, an innovator, can hold the whole world hostage on this. So we see a real opportunity with this treaty to challenge and to move forward to get lenacapavir, to use it to drive down new infections and maybe reach the end of HIV. In Latin America, your region is here. No company has been licensed. No company has been licensed to produce lenacapavir. Yet, this is the region where new infections have been rising instead of decreasing. It's just wrong. So this pandemic agreement provides the framework for a more equitable global health system, and we are going to use it to push harder. I keep telling Gilead that, Gilead, you cannot repeat the history of the past. You have to move further and get everyone to have access to this magical, I call it a magical innovation. Over to you.
Thank you, Winnie. Well, I think that the first thing is that the agreement has also like created this ecosystem that brings together the agreement, the global coalition, and some other initiatives all moving in the same direction. And I think that one of the things is that it creates a structure beyond circumstances. And I think that this is like the thing we should be focusing when circumstances arrive. We should be prepared with a structural situation that make us be like one step higher. The other thing is that I think that this increase in the production capacities in medium, low, and low, medium, and low income countries may change the situation, because I think that the current the TRIPS reduction is not thought by for a world where every region has the capacity to produce drugs. And I think that, well, we have the example of Brazil some decades ago with everything related to HIV that really changed the landscape. And this is studying the situation with Brazil with the universal treatment access with HIV was the first time that I studied everything related to access to drugs. I was in the medicine faculty at that time, and I think that was a very big milestone. And now we are really in a moment that the capacity of production is really emerging in many different countries, and I think that it really can change the situation that we are having. And I think that from high-income countries, we have also a responsibility. I think that we cannot be talking with pharma companies, for instance, with Gilead talking about lenacapavir, or with Big Pharma talking about dolutegravir, only at a domestic level. I think that these conversations should tackle the fact that they also have a role at a global health level. Next week, I think that the Spanish government is going to approve our national global health strategy. It's going to be like the first time that we have a national global health strategy. And one of the points is related to global access to technology. And I think that we have this responsibility, and we have this obligation to try to link the domestic actions to the global action, especially in health topics that are mainly and very especially global. Because if we don't do that, we are going to fall in these neglected people and even in non-neglected diseases.
Well, I agree with Winnie, and now I think that Javier put a point that I'd like to mention, that is to treat this kind of challenges in the global level. I think that is the right way, I think, combine national level with the global level. Just to mention that in Brazil, we have this tradition of HIV/AIDS equity access. Dr. Draulio Barroso is now a director of the Department for HIV/AIDS and many other diseases. But we have to think that the unstable process, political process, is of course a challenge as well. We cannot forget the political dimension, because in Brazil I am proud of my country, but we reconstruct many policies. That's true, and so it's very, very important in the sense political commitment, not only national level, about what we need in health to face new pandemics. So, and we saw yesterday the attacks against the agreement. So we are not in a room alone discussing things and think about future and ignoring all these political dimensions. I think that you have to put this on the table. And maybe because of this, it's not contradictory. We could be and should be more open to dialogue and to try to find a consensus. And I think I see the pandemic agreement in this perspective as well. But I just want to mention one point that I think that was not very well highlighted by all of us. That's the role of WHO. I think at this time it's very important to reinforce, strengthen this role in the multilateralism. And another point that I think that is a critical point to be faced in terms of the new pandemic is that social protection, because I think that social protection is difficult in many countries, but you have to put this on table. And I think that this point, just a final point, that is the One Health perspective. As it was very controversial during the debates, Brazil adopted this perspective as intersectorial driver for Brazilian policies. So I think that is a point for future debates to clarify why this perspective should be reinforced. In other words, I think that you have a pedagogical role as well. Discuss with society very deeply about all the meaning of this, because for many people, pandemic is something in the past and not a challenge in the present and for the future.
So we are going to open up for questions. briefly. I've done a terrible job of moving us quite quickly enough because these people are quite interesting. So with apologies for that. And I also know, Precious, that you need to hop away in just a moment. So let me do this. Let me give you a word of closing, and then we'll open it up to everybody. So this does not go away. And hello to the many people around the world who are online on the piece. We'll have just a few minutes for a Q&A with the group. But Precious, let me just thank you for your work again, and kind of leave you with the question of, if you look ahead to the next 12 months, what will be the signs, do you think, that we are moving in a track that is actually going to make this agreement have teeth and have the kind of impact, so that both, and I really appreciate that you said this, both today's pandemics, AIDS remains a pandemic, and the pandemics that are on the way that we don't know quite what they will become, so that actually we're moving in the right direction to be more safe and more just as we go. So I leave you with that, and then whatever else you'd like to leave us with before you have to run away.
Yes, no, thank you. I think in the interim, as we, work on PABs and start preparatory work through IGWIC, it's important that we look at this window of opportunity as a way to deal with the pandemics comprehensively, because there's only one system in a country. You don't have a system for AIDS, for NCDs. It's one system. And from that perspective, as we prepare, as we look at the health workforce, we must understand that we are doing it to prepare for disasters, but to deal with the existing ones. And that should be the kind of prism that we use in the implementation phase. The second is that I know that you indicated that we didn't talk about WHO, frankly, because this has been a member states-led process. This pandemic agreement is a member states pandemic agreement, not WHO. And I know that when people talk about WHO, they mean secretariat, because in any event, WHO is the World Health Assembly. It's those people who are currently at the Palais discussing, debating. So yeah, this pandemic agreement is member states led. They determined what is it that had to be incorporated. They defined the substantive elements that had to be included from the very beginning. So it was a very bizarre way of working, because we had to wait and say, okay, tell us, what do you want to see included? And which is not common, I think, I'm told, with other treaties and how, treaties are done. So for me, it's about ownership. Member states wanted to ensure that they can own this process. This can be seen as their product. And sovereignty has been emphasized. It's not undermined in this pandemic agreement. Then there's this misinformation and misleading statements that WHO is going to control countries. It can not be further from the truth. And I think we need to correct that at every single moment it's raised. We need to correct that and clarify that it's not WHO actually, it's member states. And my parting shots are that thank you, Winnie, for the support and all of you. Civil society has been brilliant, and I'm hoping that with the PAPs, we can learn. But like I said, let's learn from HIV/AIDS. We mobilize scientists, we mobilize civil society, and this is why we're able to fight and deal with this horrible virus. And I'm hoping that for this process, we'll be able to mobilize these resources to help us meet the deadline of WHA 79th. And this opportunity is an opportunity of a lifetime. I don't want to use any discriminatory language in this room, but I know there are people who are younger than me. I'm saying this pandemic is about you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being here and for joining us, and as we go. So we'll open it up for just a few minutes now for Q&A before we wrap up. And so let me open it in the room. Somebody's got the mic. I think Mahesh has a mic, and so we have a few moments there. And then for those that are online, I know many are online in a through the live stream, and so you can't ask questions, but the handful of you that are online in the Zoom can. So Sheila, over to you to start us off, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you very much. I'm Sheila Klo, former UNAIDS Regional Director for Eastern and Southern Africa, and now Special Ambassador for African Union Malaria Alliance. My concern as a gender activist is really the role of agreed language in what it plays in the treaties. Winnie, you and I participated in the Beijing Declaration, and to me, it's agreed language. So as Precious was negotiating all this with the countries, there were areas where I would read and think, okay, this is already agreed language. It will pass. So what has come out, the gender activist in me, I mean, it's great work that has been done, but there's a little pain in there that is saying it's not enough. So I want to know from, I guess, you and anybody who's here to say, what is now the role of already agreed language, information of pandemic treaties? Should we just forget it or what? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a few, and then we'll come back to the panelists. So we've got somebody in the back corner, and then we'll move to the next.
Thank you, panel. Good morning. Amitabh Shorkar from Tampere University in Finland and UN Research in Geneva. My question is that, do you see that inequalities are often rooted into the structural factors of political, economic, commercial architect? In this sense, is there any possibility how pandemic accord, the new treaty, will be integrated within the international law, the convergence of the treaty? So there would be an expression into the common rule of law for all the state parties, whether there is any possibility. I'm particularly talking about, say, internationally recognized mechanisms and instruments for human rights. There are other, obviously, CBG, other treaties also, which is cross-sectoral right now, the pandemic treaty, and cross-geographic. So it will be really helpful what we think of in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you. And then I think we've got space for one other. Go for it.
My name is Tiwa from Medicines Patent Pool. Congratulations to everyone relating to the pandemic agreement. So access to technology is crucial, but in addition to that, the ability of countries to absorb is also crucial. It's also important. So how do we translate the success that has been achieved at the global level in terms of the coordinated effort that led to this pandemic agreement to happen at the country level, so that those crucial, extremely important other part of the puzzle can be addressed, like infrastructure, policy, environment, etc. This is so important. What needs to happen at the global level appear to have happened. Now, where the thing needs to happen, I mean, the next step needs to, where this thing needs to have some kind of meaning is at the country level. And how do we really get things moving in that aspect? It's not all countries that are really up to speed in this regard. Thanks.
Thank you. And then our last question right here.
Thank you, panelists. Michael Semakula is my name, from Uganda. That is Alliance of Women Advocating for Change, is the organization, a grassroots network of sex work organizations. And we commend UNAIDS for your support towards making sure that the communities are at the center of addressing the pandemics and epidemics through the community actors for HIV+ in Uganda. And my question was going to Precious, but I think it can be to any of the panelists. And she was raising the issue of the gender integration within the pandemic treaty. And I'm happy that someone talked about the language within. And I was asking that in the next couple of months that we have to address the issues around the pubs, around tech transfer, around R&D, isn't this an opportunity for us? And what can we add civil society to support, to push for, ensure that the gender integration is integrated or incorporated within the agreement? Thank you.
All right, so we've got kind of four questions pieces, and I might go Nisia, Javier, and let you wrap us up, Winnie. So our four questions of kind of gender, right? Are we stuck in a world where we're not able to make more progress when it comes to kind of gender on these pieces in this moment? A question on absorption and absorption capacity, a question on international law and how we get this kind of to mobilize the other parts of the international system, and then a piece on civil society opportunities. So Nisia, whichever one of those you'd like to take, over to you.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think that the implementation of the pandemic agreement is a very huge challenge for us. And I think that to face them, we need work in a network with institutions, with the basis of each country. So I think that is one point that I would like to stress. We have in all of the world institutions who could be mobilized for this effort. Institutions of science and technology, academic world. And so I think that we didn't mention this very emphatically, and I think that is an important point for the steps from now to the next year. I would like to mention as well the topic about civil society and the national levels. I think that we need educational process, communication, very strong to societies, specific groups. It demands good organization, but now I think that we have a possibility of mobilizing institutions besides UNAIDS, UNITAID, and agencies. We can mobilize a network for this. So I think that you cannot close the discussion in traditional health forum. The colleague who asked about human rights, I think that put a very important point. We have to enlarge multisectoral, intersectoral discussion about all the topics of the pandemic, and to put in discussion with economic forum and all the forums. It's not a matter for health alone. So you have to work in other places besides the health forums. That's the points that I'd like to mention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier.
Thank you, Matthew. Some words about the link between the pandemic agreement and the works at the country level. I think that something very interesting is that we should identify which countries go faster at landing the pandemic agreement at the country level, and how to make them in a kind of benchmarking, being like the model to some others. I think that there are some coalition of organizations that can really make this job in order to identify and trying to make it universal at the regional level. So identifying, because maybe the thing that it's going to be made on Germany, on Chile, are not the same that should be made on Kenya or in China. So I think that trying to identify it at the regional level and make this work together. It's also a way of giving continuity to the pandemic agreement, and not that to leave it just here or be something from Geneva, you know, and make it and bring it to different countries to feel it as their own thing. And for instance, in Spain, we are now working in our royal decree on preparedness and response. So it's going to be related to what we have been working in the pandemic agreement. So I think it's very important. About the gender integration, yes, I think that this is like a barrier that we are facing in everything we are working. And then I think that we should work from a human rights perspective on intersectionality as a way of trying to focus on that from different perspectives. No, we don't have to renounce to that. We should be very clear and very strict on defending these positions. But I think that the way of working on that maybe not simplifying, but complexizing that. And I think that this is like maybe the way of working to that.
And finally to Winnie.
Thank you, Matt. During COVID, we watched in outrage as the world failed to learn the lessons from HIV, which we'd been fighting for decades. I set up an alliance called the People's Vaccine Alliance, campaigning for equitable access to technology, to share the technology by waiving the intellectual property rules. WHO set up what they called the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, encouraging innovators to share. But pharma companies boycotted it. Even AstraZeneca, whose vaccine was 99% funded by the Oxford University Public Institution, also refused. But Spain was one of the few countries that put a technology there in the pool. Secretary Padilla, we thank you and your government for showing that solidarity, that leadership. But most refused to share, and mostly people in the global south paid with their lives. We kept saying never again in our alliance. Now this is the agreement that gives us a chance to put it right, to end the over-reliance on donations from rich countries and their pharma companies. You said it well, Secretary Padilla, that innovation, science is production, technological innovations are coming from more and more different regions, not concentrated in one. But we need an ecosystem to enable it. Remember, it was South Africa that isolated Omicron variant. They came up with an mRNA vaccine of their own. This is Africa, the weakest region in science and technology. So we have more and more opportunity to see that everywhere, in every region, there's a capacity to produce and to save lives. We can break the inequality cycle. That is why this council, I commend this council. Many of you will know already about Sir Michael Marmot, who is the chair of this global council. His research showing that a person's health is largely determined by one's access to employment, to education, to housing, to social safety nets. These are the social determinants of health and how important they are for pandemic preparedness and response. So the research of the Inequality Council has shown this relationship between inequality and pandemics, that inequalities turn outbreaks into pandemics, and that pandemics become more disruptive and deadly when they are in situations of inequalities. So we see that it's a cycle. It's a cycle that can be broken, and this agreement is an opportunity to do that. So Nisia, thank you for serving as a founding member of this council, for your dedicated work during Brazil's presidency. This global coalition for local and regional production, innovation, and equitable access has our undivided support. We will support it. We will campaign for it. We will see that it is a tool for breaking this inequality cycle. These are tough days in global health. The cuts to the global HIV response could see 4 million new infections, no, 6 million new infections, additional infections by 2029 in 4 years' time, 4 million additional deaths in 4 years' time. We need to fight. We need to fight, and Sheila, you couldn't have put it better. This is a time where we are holding, maintain is the word, maintain, to maintain the gains that we have made. There is such a pushback against what we have won over so many years that just maintaining it is the fight we are in. And we are not going to give up. We're going to keep battling. And I thank you all for being here for this very important discussion. This is the journey. This is the way to fight. Thank you.
So with that, let me close us up. I'm told that we had people joining us online from around the world, from I think 100 countries. So thank you very much to our panelists who joined us. I'll close with a little quote. One of the people joining us was Maria Fernanda Espinosa, former president of the General Assembly and a member of the council, who online says, the pandemic treaty adoption proves the value and the vital importance of multilateralism, and that it's capable to deliver. One of the things that we said, that I was saying to Precious before we started, is that right now, I stand to be corrected, so someone should tell me how many things have not only been negotiated, but passed in the last 12 months. In this moment of acrimony, in this moment of geopolitical challenge, and yet here we stand with a pandemic agreement that is not everything we would want, but the beginning of a powerful movement that might push onward. That is a sign that global health, despite its reports of its death, is far, far from dead. And instead, we can actually keep pushing towards something that is equitable, powerful, and improves people's health. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for joining us online around the world. Have a good one.